I thought, in the spirit of a war that took forever to finish, I'd make a video that would take forever to make as well. So where we last left off, Charles V was, among a few more important titles, the Lord of the Netherlands, which contained Friesland. He tried his hand at some centralization. Luther the Hammer Boy accidentally overthrew the centuries-old religious order of Europe. Charles went all in on Catholicism, and then he abdicated. His son, Philip II, inherited most of his Western European possessions in 1556. Unlike his dad, who was born and raised in modern-day Belgium, the Spanish Philip had no personal fondness for the Dutch. His reign started in the Low Countries and got off to a rocky start. The Frisian representative to his inauguration allegedly refused to kneel for him. Quote, "Wie Friesen knibbel je alleen nog voor God." Opposition to Philip coalesced behind three noblemen: Lamoraal van Egmond, Philips de Montmorency, both better known by their titles, the Count of Egmond and the Count of Hoorn, and most importantly, William of Orange-Nassau. William was born in Germany in 1533 and was raised as a Lutheran. He was heir to this county, but instead he inherited his namesake title, the Princedom of Orange. But to get the title, Charles ordered him to convert to Catholicism and move to the Netherlands. He was a good friend to Charles, but less so to Philip. Nevertheless, Philip made William stadholder of Holland, Zeeland and Utrecht. Now, that was an awful lot of Dutch history talk, but we're here for Frisian history. So let's summarize the rest in a funky little rhyme. Charles and Philip said, y'all stay loyal to the Pope. But some folks said, Calvinism looks pretty dope. Philip left in 59 saying, this mess is all on you. But what was William supposed to do? Nobles gathered to lay bare their plight. More like beggars, am I right? Nobility mad, merchants mad, peasants mad. Boy Margaret, things sure look bad. Now Alva entered the fray, so Margaret went away. Things were about to go down and William fled. Court of Blood, Tithe and Egmond and Hoorn lost their head. So now we're all caught up. In 1568, William hired a large mercenary army and planned a three-pronged invasion into the Low Countries. He would lead an army himself into Limburg, Jan van Montigny would lead an invasion into Gelders, and William's brothers Louis and Adolf would lead an army to capture Groningen. They received aid from the outlawed rebels known as the Sea Beggars. The Nassau brothers scored a victory in the Battle of Heiligerlee, but this was at the cost of Adolf's life. Louis then went to besiege Groningen, but that was a bit tricky without heavy artillery and few supplies. But that doesn't matter, because the people will rise up, right? What? They won't open the gates for you? Alba's on his way? Welp, it was swell. See ya! During Louis' retreat, Alva intercepted him near the town of Jemmen, or Jemmingen in archaic Dutch. Here at the Battle of Jemmingen, Louis was soundly defeated by Alva, and he barely escaped with his life. But hey, the other invasions were a success, right? Well, let's just say, we still have 79 years to go. Before we continue, the 80 Years' War is often seen as primarily a religious war. The suppressed Calvinist people versus the Spanish oppressor, so to say. Although there certainly was a religious element to this conflict, the rebels mostly wanted to prevent unrest amongst the populace by getting rid of the Inquisition. The war was as much political and economic as religious. Until the Act of Abjuration, the war wasn't even about independence, but about repealing unpopular acts like the Inquisition and the Tithe. So it seemed the revolt was crushed before it barely got a chance to start. William was defeated and in debt. But then in 1572, the Sea Beggars decided to pull an April Fool's on Alba and captured Den Briel. This was soon followed by other cities. Among these captured cities were various Frisian ones, most memorably Dokkum, for reasons we will soon get into. With rebels having a foothold in Holland, William returned and the rebels, or statists, consolidated control over Holland and Zeeland. But the Spanish wouldn't just let this slide, as most provinces were, unlike Holland and Zeeland, still in Spanish hands, including Friesland. The man in charge of Friesland was Caspar de Robles. He came from a minor Portuguese noble family, but managed to climb the ladder due to his mom. He was a colonel in the Spanish army and commanded Alba's cavalry during the Battle of Jemmingen. Afterwards, He was sent to oversee the construction of a citadel in Groningen in order to subdue the city. He was named the stadholder of Friesland, Groningen, Drenthe and Overijssel in 1573. In modern memory, he is most famous for having a hand in repairing the dikes after the All Saints flood of 1570. But in actuality, he barely got involved at all. And often forgotten is that he was a ruthless leader, often handing out severe punishments to get his way. When he couldn't provide his soldiers pay, which being on the Spanish side was often, he allowed his troops to go out and loot. Then again, the sea beggars weren't so great either, as they often resorted to plundering as well, and acted more like basic bandits than soldiers. But what really highlights the Robles' ruthless cruelty was his reaction to Dockham's fall. After Dockham fell on 12 September 1572, the Robles immediately sent a response. He sent a small army of about 560 Walloon mercenaries from Louet to recapture the city, while on their turn Dockham called for aid from Frenchir. The defenders were easily overwhelmed. In order to set an example, the Robles allowed the soldiers to raise the city. It didn't matter what church they belonged to, or whether they supported the Spanish or not. No one was safe from the marauding soldiers. Only late in the evening did the massacre stop. According to a contemporary source, the Robles only halted the murder after word had reached earlier refugees, and they begged long enough for mercy. And when the day of killing stopped, a night of plunder began. The soldiers, forced to stop killing, now robbed everything they could from the city. On their way back to Louet, they were ambushed by the late French reinforcements. The Walloons were easily routed, and the looted goods were brought along to Frenchir. The destruction of Dockham came to be known as the Walloon Fury. Let's just hope this doesn't become a trend. Like I said, the Spanish had a habit of not being able to pay their troops. Some soldiers were less than happy with this fact. In 1576, the Robles was captured in Groningen by mutineers. He was released but was removed from power. He returned to the Spanish army and died in the siege of Antwerpen in 1585. All that's left of the man who allowed the first of the Furies to break loose is a monument for his supposed work on the Frisian dikes. A huge two-faced pillar originally called terminus, but more commonly known as the Stenen Man. In 1577, the statists and the Spanish nearly reconciled. King Philip and all provinces but one agreed to the Union of Brussels. Within this union, there were several compromises made by the king to ensure peace. But this union didn't last. The Spanish broke the truce after only a few months by seizing Namen. Then, in the southwest, both Calvinists and Catholics rejected the tolerance of the union. As the Calvinists seized several cities, two provinces formed the Union of Arras and then restored Spanish rule. In response to this, the Statists formed the Union of Utrecht in 1579. This union would form the foundation upon which the Dutch Republic would later be created. There were two important consequences of the failed Union of Brussels. First, the removal of the Spanish troops meant that the rebels were now in a far better position than before. Secondly, the pacification of Ghent ensured that the Statists would, for now, accept both Catholics and Protestants. When the Robles' garrison mutinied 3 years earlier, the fate of the north was up in the air. William of Orange capitalized on this and sent his friend George de Lalaing to replace Caspar as the northern stadtholder. George was also better known by his title, the Count of Rennenberg. Within the framework of the pacification of Ghent, the Catholic Rennenberg tried to win over his territories for the Catholic faith. Rennenberg was an enthusiastic supporter of the Union of Utrecht and wished to see his territories participate. But making Friesland and the city of Groningen join the Union was met with heavy resistance from the ruling classes. And after having to siege Overijssel into the Union, his enthusiasm dwindled. Rennenberg's position then became a difficult one. He had been fighting for the Statists, but then Friesland and Overijssel deposed Rennenberg, and he started losing favor with the Statists. At the same time, the Spanish were beginning a new offensive, and the Statist cause was starting to look grim. With one side gaining ground, and the other starting to doubt him, he made a decision. On the 3rd of March 1580, he purged the city of Groningen from non-Catholics, and declared himself for the Spanish side. Rennenberg's betrayal had two big impacts. The first one was piling on to the growing distrust towards Catholics. The second one was giving the Spanish a strategic position in the north, as the city of Groningen became a thorn in the Statist side. So for now, Friesland is no longer on the Spanish side. So before we continue, let's see what the rest of the Union was up to. Well, after the great progress of 1572 and the creation of the Union in 1579, William was faced with a big opponent, the Duke of Parma, Alexander Farnese, who became the governor of the Netherlands in 1578. His 9 years in power, creatively dubbed Parma's 9 years, were marked by increased success for the Spanish, as he managed to recapture huge swaths of territory, especially in the south. In 1581, the Estates General no longer recognized Philip as their king. Now, a stadholder with no lord to hold stad for is kinda silly, so the statists searched for a replacement. First they tried William Skynyrd, the Duke of Anjou, but all he did was scheming, badly. So that was a no. Then they toyed with the idea of just naming William, who was kinda leading this whole thing anyway, as their lord, but sup party people? Yeah, he was no longer an option. Then they tried this English guy, but he was a very poor leader. So then they decided, screw it! The States General is now the lord that the stadholder serves, and thus the Dutch Republic was born. But who were these handsome strangers that were now stadholders? Well, let's find out. William's son, Maurice of Orange-Nassau, became Prince of Orange and stadholder of Holland and Zeeland. His nephew William Louis of Nassau-Dillenburg became stadholder of Friesland. William Louis was born in 1560 and was raised in Dillenburg, of which he later became count. He was a bit unique for his family, as he was not really a womanizer. He married the love of his life in 1587. She was Anna of Nassau, his cousin. Different time, different standards. Though she died only a year later. He would never remarry out of respect for her memory. Both Maurice and William Louis were very capable generals. They studied Greek, Roman and Byzantine tactics. Maurice gets most of the credit for their military reforms, but it was actually a team effort. William Louis believed that soldiers' pay should be provided at all times. In exchange for the consistent pay, he demanded strict discipline from his troops. Both believed that unlike medieval knights, the early modern soldiers' individual skill was less important than holding a formation. William Louis convinced Maurice to implement the countermarch, in order to allow soldiers to effectively volley fire, as seen on screen. This technique would later be perfected by Gustavus Adolphus, which led to the early modern military revolution. Now, if you know anything about Roman tactics, you'll know that they love to build forts. So no wonder that these two Rome fanboys made a certain type of speedily built fortification a staple of this war, the sconce. They didn't invent them, and they were already in use, but they made great use of it. A sconce is a cheap and easily thrown up fort made out of earth and trenches, and sometimes strengthened with palisades and a moat. They could be used for both defense and offense. The statists attempted to drive Rennenberg out of Groningen in 1580, but their attempts failed. Rennenberg died in 1581. His betrayal had left Groningen, the Omlanden and Drenthe in Spanish hands. Once in charge, William Louis went hard at work at organizing defenses for Friesland. But when Friesland needed him most, he vanished. Actually, he was in Zeeland to welcome the English guy. In the winter of 1585, the Spanish bypassed the fortifications via frozen streams and lakes. They poured about 4,000 troops into Friesland and went ham on plundering and burning the province. William Louis returned with haste, but became trapped in Staveren, because, army. A small army of about 1,000 troops gathered around one of his lieutenants, the Dane Stein Malsen. After realizing he was outmanned, he retreated to the small village of Boxum and started digging in. But before he was settled in, the Spanish army fell upon them. They stood no chance and the Spanish showed no mercy. But then I guess Persephone went back to her mom, because spring was in the air. Afraid of being trapped behind the fortifications, the Spanish quickly retreated over the frozen lakes, leaving behind their ill-gotten gains. Equipped with their classical knowledge, the cousins went on the offensive. To trump Parma's 9 years, their campaign was dubbed the 10 years. Maurice found many a victory in the south with their new military reforms and some clever Trojan tactics. Both he and his nephew tried to avoid costly battles as much as they could. In the north, William Louis decided that Groningen was a nut too tough to crack head-on. So they decided to cut the city off from the Spanish, in the Groningers Sconce War. Building and capturing many sconces placed on key positions to prevent the city from being resupplied and reinforced. Yet even after all of this, the two stadholders needed to commit to a short siege of 2 months in 1594 before the city surrendered. With the reduction of Groningen, the city and the surrounding lands were, a bit unwillingly, joined together. They became the province of Stad en Lande and were forcibly admitted to the Union of Utrecht. William Louis became the stadholder of Stad en Lande, and 2 years later of Drenthe as well. After this victory, not only had some waves been made, an entire tide had been shifted. With Groningen reduction, the entire north was in statist hands. Now they could fully focus on the south, and the Spanish had lost their advantageous position as the war was sucking their coffers dry. And with some help from the English, a huge Spanish fleet sank a few years earlier. Then the Spanish decided what they couldn't do in the Netherlands, they try out in France. So now the Union, from now on known as the United Provinces, were able to gain more influence abroad. For example, they mingled in East Frisian politics, granting Emden semi-independence and turning it and later East Frisia into a Dutch satellite state until the 30 Years' War. The 80 Years' War raged on for a good 15 more years. In 1609, the United Provinces and Spain declared a 12-year-long truce. The second phase of this war would kick off during the 30 Years' War, but this phase had less impact on Friesland. So, let's now take a peek at what happened during this truce, shall we? Ever since the Saxons put an end to the Frisian freedom, Friesland has been known as the Lordship of Friesland. But when Philip lost control of Friesland, it joined the soon-to-be United Provinces. Now the Union and the Nassaus had big impacts on Friesland. For example, the states of Friesland were restructured. Rennenberg reorganized the province's municipalities into 3 areas, based on the old shires. Then William of Orange, per request of the cities, added a 4th area, consisting of the 11 Frisian cities. These 4 areas were, creatively, called quarters. The city quarter argued that their larger financial contribution meant that they should wield more influence. But their bid was unsuccessful, and they remained a 4th voice. Each quarter sent 2 representatives chosen by the Grietenijen, 1 nobleman and 1 landowner. To compromise with their desires, the cities got to send 3 representatives, bringing the total number to 9 representatives. This structure would stay in place as the governing body of Friesland until the Batavian Republic in 1795. The Reformed or Calvinist Church became the unofficial state religion of the United Provinces. Though they practiced that sweet pragmatic tolerance, well, more like coexistence. Any Christian denomination, and even Jews, were allowed to practice their faith, as long as they did it privately. So officially there was no state religion, but Calvinists enjoyed a privileged position. This was also the case in Friesland after 1580, when they ousted Rennenberg. Unlike the tolerant William of Orange, William Louis was a zealous Calvinist, so he only encouraged their privilege. When a riot broke out in Ljouwert in 1610, demanding more influence for non-Calvinists, William Louis bickered with them for a good 7 years, but in the end came out on top. Another way William Louis strengthened the position of the Reformed Church was the founding of the University of Friesland. During the revolt, William of Orange founded the University of Leiden in 1575, with the University of Friesland following 10 years later. The university was founded by the States of Friesland, and William Louis was an enthusiastic supporter of this plan. There was a very specific goal for this university. See, with Catholicism falling out of favor, the province needed to replace the well-educated priests with well-educated preachers. But more about that next time. William Louis died of a stroke in 1620. He never had any children to inherit his titles. After his death, Maurice expected to gain all of William Louis's titles. But the Frisian states chose his younger brother, Ernst Casimir, as stadholder. Ernst Casimir had already been Count of Nassau-Dietz after their father's death. The other stadholderships still went to Maurice. This was kinda pointless, however, because when he died, they still went to Ernst Casimir anyway. William of Orange was dubbed the Vader des Vaderlands, or Father of the Fatherland. For his role in Friesland, William Louis was named Us Heit, our father. These days you can visit Ljouwert. Here you can see his restored tomb in the Jacobin church and visit his statue near his old residence. You can also honor him by drinking the beer that is named in his honor. Cheers, WL. I actually don't like beer. Hey y'all, you wouldn't believe how much I had to scrap from this video. I was going to talk about the University of Friesland as an entire subject as well. But this would have made the video way too long, so I pushed it over to the next video. Anyway, if y'all want to pay your respects to Us Heit, then please consider leaving a like, comment, and click that subscribe button. Also, if you want to see said scrapped part, then don't forget to click the bell icon to get notified when the next video is uploaded. Have a good one and see y'all next time.